The Sunday morning sun cast a golden glow over the tree-lined streets of Pinecrest Heights. Richard Matthews wiped sweat from his brow as he carefully watered the newly planted rose bushes in front of his brick colonial home. After months of searching, he had finally found the perfect place to put down roots, a charming house with a spacious yard in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. As a cardiac surgeon who spent most of his waking hours at the hospital, Richard cherished these quiet weekend moments tending to his garden. He hummed softly to himself while checking the soil around a struggling plant. So absorbed was he in his task that he didn't notice the woman marching across the street until her shadow fell over the flower bed. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" The sharp voice cut through the peaceful morning. Richard straightened up slowly, garden hose still in hand, and turned to face a middle-aged woman with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. He recognized her vaguely as the owner of the large white house across the street, though they'd never spoken. He offered a friendly smile. "Good morning. Just taking care of these new plants before the heat kicks in." The woman, whom Richard would later learn was named Karen Whitfield, did not return his smile. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes darting between Richard and the front door of the house. "I mean, what are you doing at this property?" she asked, emphasizing each word as if speaking to someone who didn't understand English. "The Hendersons moved out 2 weeks ago." Richard's smile faded slightly, but he maintained his polite tone. "Yes, I know. I bought the house from them. Moved in last weekend." He gestured toward the front door with his free hand. "I'm Richard, by the way." Karen's posture remained rigid. "Well, nobody informed the neighborhood association about new residents." She glanced pointedly at the moving boxes still visible through the front window. "We like to keep track of who belongs here." Richard turned off the hose and set it down, giving Karen his full attention. At 42, he had experienced these types of interactions before. The suspicious glances, the not-so-subtle questioning of his presence in certain spaces. As much as he wished otherwise, his Harvard medical degree and professional success didn't shield him from moments like these. "I'm not sure what to tell you," Richard said calmly. "The sale was finalized last month. Everything's in order." He brushed soil from his hands. "If there's some kind of welcome committee or neighborhood association form I need to fill out, I'd be happy to do that." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't just let anyone move into Pinecrest Heights. This is a respectable community with standards. People who live here work hard to afford these homes." The implication hung in the air between them. Richard felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of anger and weariness that he had learned to control over the years. He took a deep breath. "I assure you, I worked very hard for this home," he said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lot of unpacking to do." He bent down to pick up the garden shears he'd left on the grass. Karen took a quick step backward, as if his movement had startled her. "Are those the homeowner's gardening tools? Did they leave them behind?" Richard straightened up again, shears in hand. "These are my tools. As I said, I'm the homeowner now. I'm going to need to see some proof of that." Karen pulled her phone from the pocket of her cardigan. "For all I know, you could be trespassing." Richard stared at her for a long moment, weighing his response. Part of him wanted to march into the house, grab his deed and ID, and thrust them in her face. Another part wanted to simply ignore her and continue with his gardening. But experience had taught him that neither approach would likely end well. "I don't carry my house deed while I'm gardening," he said finally, "but I live here now. You're welcome to check with the real estate office if you have concerns." Karen lifted her chin. "The Hendersons would have told me if they sold to, well, they would have mentioned new neighbors. Perhaps they thought it wasn't necessary," Richard suggested, his patience wearing thin but his voice remaining steady. "Now, I really do need to finish up here before my shift at the hospital." "You work at a hospital?" Karen's tone suggested she found this difficult to believe. "Yes, I'm a cardiac surgeon at City General." Richard didn't add that he was, in fact, the head of cardiothoracic surgery. He shouldn't need to list his credentials to justify his presence in his own front yard. Karen seemed momentarily thrown by this information, but quickly recovered. "Well, anyone can say anything, can't they? The fact remains that this is a close-knit community. We look out for each other and for our properties." Richard nodded. "That's good to hear. I look forward to being part of that community." He deliberately turned away from her and knelt back down by his rose bushes, hoping she would take the hint. She didn't. I'm going to have to ask you to stop whatever you're doing until we sort this out, Karen insisted, her voice rising slightly. If you really are the new owner, you won't mind waiting while I make a few calls. Richard continued working, carefully pruning a damaged stem. I do mind, actually. These plants need water and care, and I have limited free time. He didn't look up. Feel free to make whatever calls you feel are necessary, but I'm going to continue taking care of my garden. From the corner of his eye, he saw Karen's hands tighten around her phone. She stood there for another moment before turning sharply and walking back across the street, already dialing a number. Richard sighed deeply as he watched her retreat to her pristine white colonial. He had researched this neighborhood thoroughly before buying, the quality of the schools, thinking of the children he hoped to have someday, the low crime rate, the proximity to the hospital. The real estate agent had been enthusiastic about showing him the property, talking up the exclusive community and like-minded neighbors. Richard wondered now what exactly she had meant by those phrases. He continued working in his garden, but the peace of the morning was gone. He found himself glancing up every few minutes, watching as Karen paced on her front porch, gesturing animatedly while talking on her phone. At one point, she seemed to be taking photos of him in his house. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, grateful for the distraction, and saw a text from his brother James. "How's the unpacking going? Need any help?" Richard smiled slightly. James had offered to come by later with dinner from their favorite restaurant. As the mayor of the city, James had a packed schedule, but he always made time for family. Richard hesitated, then typed back, "Unpacking fine. Having an interesting first encounter with the neighbors, though. Tell you about it later." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood up to stretch his back. The roses were tended to now, their vibrant red blooms standing out against the green foliage. Richard had just picked up his gardening tools when he noticed a police cruiser turning slowly onto his street. At first, he thought they must be patrolling or heading elsewhere. But then the car pulled up directly in front of his house and 2 officers stepped out. Richard felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he watched them approach. From across the street, Karen had emerged from her house again and stood watching with poorly concealed satisfaction. Richard set his tools down carefully and straightened his shoulders. He'd done nothing wrong. This was his home, his property. Yet here he was, about to explain himself to police, officers who had been called simply because he existed in a space where someone like Karen didn't think he belonged. As the officers approached, one older with graying hair at his temples, one younger with a stiff, uncertain posture, Richard took a deep breath and prepared himself for what was to come. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted his brother again. "Actually, might need your help sooner than expected. Police just showed up at my house." Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed over her chest as the officers reached Richard's front yard. The confrontation that had been brewing all morning was about to come to a head. And Richard knew that what happened next would define his place in this neighborhood for years to come. The 2 police officers stopped a few feet away from Richard. The older officer, whose nameplate read Jackson, had lines around his eyes that deepened as he squinted in the morning sunlight. His younger partner hung back slightly, one hand resting near his belt, his posture stiff and wary. "Good morning, sir," Officer Jackson said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Mind if we have a word with you?" Richard nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Years of performing high-pressure surgeries had taught him to control his outward reactions, even when his heart raced beneath his ribs. "Of course, officers. How can I help you?" he asked, setting his gardening gloves on the ground beside the hose. The younger officer stepped forward. "We received a call about a possible trespasser at this address." His eyes scanned Richard from head to toe, taking in his soil-stained jeans and faded university t-shirt. Someone reported an unknown individual on the property. From across the street, Karen stood watching with her arms crossed, close enough to observe but not to hear the conversation. A few other neighbors had emerged from their homes as well, pretending to check their mail or water their lawns while stealing glances at the scene unfolding on Richard's front yard. Richard took a deep breath. "I'm not trespassing. I live here. I just moved in last weekend." Officer Jackson's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossing his face. "You purchased the Henderson place?" "That's right," Richard confirmed. "Richard Matthews." I closed on the house 3 weeks ago. The younger officer, his nameplate read Brennan, had frowned. We'll need to see some identification, sir. Richard felt a familiar tightness in his chest. My wallet is inside the house. Would you like me to get it? Officer Brennan nodded curtly. I'll accompany you. That won't be necessary, Brennan, Officer Jackson cut in, his tone firmer than before. Dr. Matthews can retrieve his ID. We'll wait here. Richard paused, surprised that the older officer knew his title. He glanced at Officer Jackson more carefully and suddenly placed him. The officer had been at City General 6 months ago when his wife had undergone an emergency appendectomy. Richard had been walking through the ER when the woman was brought in, and had stopped to offer his colleague some assistance when complications arose. Thank you, Officer Jackson, Richard said quietly, then turned toward his front door. He could feel multiple pairs of eyes on his back as he walked up the path to his porch. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the key in the lock, not from fear, but from the effort of containing his anger and humiliation. Inside, Richard leaned against the closed door for a moment, letting out a long, slow breath. Boxes still lined his hallway, most labeled in his neat handwriting: kitchen, office, books. The house didn't fully feel like home yet, and this morning's events weren't helping. He found his wallet on the kitchen counter and pulled out his driver's license. After a moment's thought, he also grabbed the folder containing his house deed and closing documents from his home office. Better to end this quickly and definitively. When Richard stepped back outside, he noticed 2 more neighbors had joined the spectators, standing on the sidewalk and speaking in low voices. Karen remained on her porch, phone still in hand, likely recording the entire interaction. Richard approached the officers and handed his license to Officer Jackson. Here's my ID, and these are my closing documents for the house, if you need to see those as well. Officer Jackson examined the license briefly, then handed it back without looking at the additional paperwork. That won't be necessary, Dr. Matthews. I apologize for the disturbance. Officer Brennan, however, reached for the folder. We should verify the property ownership just to be thorough. Richard hesitated, then handed over the documents. The younger officer flipped through them with unnecessary slowness, his expression suggesting he was looking for discrepancies. Everything appears to be in order, Officer Brennan finally admitted, returning the folder. Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. We have to respond to all calls we receive. I understand you're doing your job, Richard said evenly, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. But I'd like to know exactly what I was reported for. What was suspicious about a man gardening on a Sunday morning? The officers exchanged glances. Officer Jackson cleared his throat. The caller reported an unknown individual who might be trespassing or vandalizing the property. Said the Hendersons had moved out and no one should be here. The caller mentioned they'd never seen you in the neighborhood before, Officer Brennan added, and were concerned about recent break-ins in the area. Richard raised an eyebrow. Have there been break-ins in this neighborhood recently? Officer Jackson shook his head slightly. Nothing reported in Pinecrest Heights in the past 6 months. A car engine rumbled down the street, drawing everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV with government plates pulled up behind the police cruiser. Richard recognized it immediately and felt both relief and embarrassment wash over him. He hadn't expected his brother to arrive quite so quickly. The car door opened and James Matthews stepped out, dressed in the suit he often wore for weekend city functions. At 45, James was 3 years older than Richard, and carried himself with the confident authority of someone used to commanding rooms. As the city's youngest mayor in 50 years and its first black mayor ever, James had developed a presence that was both approachable and formidable. Officer Jackson straightened immediately. Mayor Matthews, he said, surprise evident in his voice. I didn't expect to see you here this morning. James walked up the path to join them, his expression serious. I received a concerning text from my brother. He placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. Everything okay here, Rich? Across the street, Karen's smug expression had vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. She lowered her phone slowly, no longer recording. Just a misunderstanding, Richard said, though his tight smile suggested otherwise. The neighbors were concerned about an unfamiliar person in the area. James turned to the officers, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Officer Jackson, Officer Brennan, would you mind explaining why you're questioning my brother at his new home? Officer Jackson looked uncomfortable. We received a call about a possible trespasser, sir, Standard procedure to check it out. We've verified Dr. Matthews' identity and residency. We were just wrapping up. I see, James said, his tone measured. And who made this call? Before either officer could respond, Richard nodded toward Karen, who was now trying to retreat into her house unnoticed. My neighbor across the street expressed some concerns about my presence here this morning. James looked over at Karen, who froze halfway through her front door. I think I should introduce myself to your new neighbor, he said quietly to Richard. Then raising his voice, he called out, Ma'am, could we have a word, please? Karen hesitated, clearly calculating her options, before reluctantly closing her front door and walking across the street. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous smile. Good morning, Mayor Matthews, she said, her voice higher than it had been when confronting Richard. What a surprise to see you in our neighborhood. It shouldn't be, James replied coolly. My brother just moved in after all. I'm helping him get settled. Karen's face paled. Your brother? Yes. Dr. Richard Matthews, head of cardiothoracic surgery at City General. James maintained his political smile, but his eyes were hard. One of the reasons he chose this neighborhood was its reputation for being welcoming and safe. I'm disappointed to hear his first weekend here involved being reported to the police while gardening. Officer Brennan shifted uncomfortably. Officer Jackson sighed. There's been a misunderstanding, Karen stammered. We've had some concerns about security in the neighborhood, and I didn't know that my brother was the new homeowner, James finished for her, or that he belonged in this neighborhood at all. Karen's mouth opened and closed without sound. The neighbors who had been watching from a distance had inched closer, close enough now to hear the conversation. Their expressions ranged from embarrassment to shock as they realized who Richard was and who his brother was. Officer Jackson stepped forward. We'll be on our way now unless there's anything else, Dr. Matthews? Richard shook his head. No, thank you, officers. As the police officers returned to their cruiser, James turned to address not just Karen but all the neighbors who had gathered. I'm glad to see so many of you out this morning, he said, his voice carrying the practiced tone he used at community meetings. Since you're all here, let me properly introduce my brother, Dr. Richard Matthews, your new neighbor. Rich just moved in after 10 years at Johns Hopkins. We're thrilled to have him back in his hometown, where he'll be heading up the new cardiac care center at City General. Richard watched as the neighbors' expressions shifted, discomfort giving way to awkward smiles. He knew what would come next. The backpedaling, the sudden friendliness, the invitations and welcome baskets that would arrive once word spread about who he was and who he was related to. Karen's face had turned a deep shade of red. Welcome to the neighborhood, Dr. Matthews, she managed to say. I hope we can put this unfortunate incident behind us. Richard looked at her steadily. I hope so too, Mrs. Whitfield, she supplied quickly. Karen Whitfield. I live just there. She gestured vaguely toward her house. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. James squeezed Richard's shoulder, a silent question about whether he wanted to continue this conversation. Richard gave a small shake of his head. He'd had enough for one morning. If you'll excuse us, Richard said to the gathered neighbors, my brother and I have some unpacking to do. As they turned to walk into the house, leaving Karen and the other neighbors standing awkwardly on the sidewalk, James leaned close to Richard's ear. Welcome to Pinecrest Heights, little brother, he murmured. Still think moving here was a good idea? Richard didn't answer as he opened his front door. The day's events had cast a shadow over his new beginning, but he was no stranger to fighting for his place in the world. This was just another battle in a lifetime of them, one he hadn't expected to face quite so soon in his new home. Inside Richard's half-unpacked living room, James loosened his tie and sank into the leather couch, one of the few pieces of furniture already set up. Richard disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 bottles of water, tossing one to his brother before sitting heavily in the armchair across from him. So, James said after a long drink, that was quite the welcome wagon. Richard rubbed his temples. Not exactly how I planned to meet the neighbors. You should have called me right away, James said, leaning forward. The minute that woman started questioning you. And do what? Have the mayor show up because someone was rude to his little brother? Richard shook his head. I've handled worse, James, you know that. James's expression darkened. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean you have to handle it alone. The brothers sat in silence for a moment, Through the front window, they could see the neighbors still gathered on the sidewalk, talking in hushed voices. Karen Whitfield had retreated to her porch but hadn't gone inside, seemingly torn between embarrassment and a desire to know what was happening next. "Think she'll lose sleep tonight?" James asked, nodding toward Karen. "Probably," Richard said. "But not for the right reasons." James raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning she's not upset about what she did. She's upset about who she did it to." Richard took a long sip of water. "If I were just some random black guy with no connection to the mayor, no fancy medical degree," he didn't need to finish the thought. Both brothers knew how differently the morning might have ended. James stood up and paced the room, stopping to examine a framed photo of their parents that Richard had already placed on the mantel. "Mom would have marched right across the street and given that woman a piece of her mind." Richard smiled despite himself. "Dad would have been right behind her, quoting the Constitution and property laws. God, I miss them," James said softly. Their parents had been gone for almost 5 years now. Their father from a heart attack, their mother from cancer just 6 months later. It was part of the reason Richard had decided to move back to his hometown after a decade away. With both parents gone, the brothers had only each other for family. A knock at the door interrupted their moment of reflection. Richard groaned. "Want me to get it?" James asked. "No," Richard said, standing up. "It's my house. I'll handle it." He opened the front door to find an older man standing on his porch holding a bottle of wine. Behind him, a woman about the same age clutched a ceramic dish covered in foil. Richard recognized them as the couple from the blue house 2 doors down, who had been among the spectators earlier. "Dr. Matthews," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Wilson. This is my wife, Patricia. We live just down the street." Richard shook the offered hand. "Nice to meet you." "We wanted to properly welcome you to the neighborhood," Patricia said, thrusting the dish forward. "Homemade lasagna. Just needs 15 minutes in the oven at 350. Richard accepted the dish automatically. "Thank you. That's very kind." Thomas cleared his throat. "We also wanted to apologize for what happened this morning. Karen doesn't speak for all of us, you understand. Pinecrest Heights is a wonderful community. We've lived here for 30 years, Patricia added earnestly. Never had any trouble." Richard wasn't sure how to respond. Were they expecting gratitude for this belated welcome, or absolution for their silence earlier, when they'd watched the confrontation without intervening? James appeared at Richard's shoulder. "Mayor Matthews," Thomas said, straightening slightly. "Good to see you again. We met at the hospital fundraiser last year." "Of course, Mr. Wilson," James replied smoothly, though his expression suggested he had no memory of the meeting. "Thank you for welcoming my brother to the neighborhood." More neighbors were approaching the house now, some carrying dishes or plants or bottles, others empty-handed but wearing apologetic smiles. Richard felt a headache building behind his eyes. "Maybe we should invite everyone in for an impromptu housewarming," James suggested under his breath, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Not a chance," Richard muttered back. Then to the Wilsons he said, "Thank you for the lasagna. I appreciate the gesture." He started to close the door, but Thomas Wilson wasn't finished. "We're having a neighborhood association meeting on Thursday evening. We'd love for you to come, Dr. Matthews, get to know everyone properly." "I'll check my schedule," Richard said noncommittally. "I work long hours at the hospital." Of course, Thomas nodded vigorously. "Well, the invitation stands. 7 o'clock at the community center." As the Wilsons finally turned to leave, another neighbor stepped forward with a potted plant. Richard braced himself for another awkward exchange. But a commotion from across the street drew everyone's attention. Karen Whitfield was marching toward Richard's house. Her husband, a tall, thin man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, trailing reluctantly behind her. The gathered neighbors parted silently, watching with undisguised curiosity. Karen stopped at the bottom of Richard's porch steps, her chin held high despite the flush on her cheeks. "Dr. Matthews," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard. "I owe you an apology." Richard leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. "Do you?" Her smile tightened. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. If the Hendersons had told me they'd sold too, if I'd known who you were, if you'd known I was the mayor's brother, or if you'd known I was a doctor," Richard asked quietly, "would that have made a difference in how you treated me?" Karen's husband shifted uncomfortably. "Karen, maybe we should—" "It's not about that at all," Karen interrupted, her voice rising slightly. It's about community safety. We've had incidents in nearby neighborhoods. I was just being cautious. Cautious, Richard repeated, the word flat. James stepped forward. Mrs. Whitfield, I understand you're the head of the Neighborhood Watch program. Karen brightened slightly. Yes, that's right, Mayor Matthews. We've kept Pinecrest Heights safe for over 15 years. Admirable, James said, his tone neutral. Though I wonder if you're aware of the community policing guidelines my office implemented last year. The ones specifically addressing racial profiling in neighborhood watch programs? The color drained from Karen's face. Several neighbors suddenly found the ground fascinating. We don't profile, Karen stammered. That's not what happened here. Then what exactly did happen, Mrs. Whitfield? James pressed. Because from where I stand, it looks like you saw a black man in your neighborhood and immediately assumed he didn't belong. Karen's husband placed a hand on her arm. Karen, let's go home. We can discuss this another time. But Karen shook him off, her embarrassment hardening into defensiveness. This isn't fair. I'm being made out to be some kind of villain when I was just trying to protect our community. How was I supposed to know he was your brother? Or a doctor? He was dressed like a what, Mrs. Whitfield? Richard asked. Karen fell silent, seeming to realize she was only digging herself deeper. I think what my wife is trying to say, her husband interjected, is that we're very sorry for the misunderstanding. We hope you'll accept our apology and allow us all to start fresh. He held out his hand to Richard. I'm Greg Whitfield, by the way. Richard hesitated, then shook the offered hand. Richard Matthews. Well, Richard, Greg said, forcing a smile. Welcome to Pinecrest Heights. If there's anything you need while you're settling in, please don't hesitate to ask. Richard nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. The crowd of neighbors watched the exchange with rapt attention, a few of them recording discreetly on their phones. This morning's drama would be all over social media by lunchtime, Richard realized. His stomach sank at the thought. I appreciate everyone's concern, Richard finally said, addressing the gathered crowd. But I've had a long week at the hospital and I still have a lot of unpacking to do. If you'll excuse me. He stepped back inside his house, James following close behind, and shut the door firmly. Through the window they watched as the neighbors slowly dispersed, returning to their homes with new gossip to share. Karen and Greg Whitfield were the last to leave. Karen's shoulders stiff with indignation as her husband guided her back across the street. Well, James said, breaking the silence, that was a complete disaster. Richard finished for him. He carried the lasagna to the kitchen and shoved it into the refrigerator, then leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. Maybe this was a mistake. Moving here, James shook his head. Don't let them drive you out, Rich. You have as much right to be here as anyone. I know that, Richard said sharply, but knowing it and living it are two different things. I didn't move back home to become the latest viral video of a black man being harassed for existing in his own space. That's not going to happen, James assured him. No, those people were filming, James. You saw them. And I'll make sure those videos never see the light of day, James said with the confidence of someone used to making problems disappear. Besides, the story wouldn't exactly make them look good. Racist neighborhood reports mayor's brother to police. Not the kind of publicity Pinecrest Heights wants. Richard laughed humorlessly. So that's my protection? Being the mayor's brother? James's expression softened. No, Rich. Your protection is being who you are, a brilliant surgeon, a good man, and someone who doesn't back down from a challenge. He glanced out the window at Karen's house across the street. And maybe being the mayor's brother doesn't hurt either. Richard sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I suppose there's one upside to all this. What's that? Free lasagna, Richard smiled faintly. And I bet we'll be getting a lot more home-cooked meals in the coming days as the neighbors try to make amends. James laughed. Silver linings, little brot. Silver linings. Outside, the street had returned to its Sunday morning quiet. But beneath the peaceful surface, Richard knew, ripples were spreading through Pinecrest Heights. By tomorrow, everyone in the neighborhood would know who he was and who his brother was. The question now was whether that knowledge would make his life here easier or infinitely more complicated. By Wednesday morning, Richard's refrigerator was packed with casseroles, pies, and Tupperware containers filled with everything from homemade cookies to fancy salads. His living room held 3 potted plants, 2 bottles of expensive wine, and a gift basket of gourmet coffee that had arrived yesterday evening, carried by a nervous-looking teenager who introduced himself as Thomas and Patricia Wilson's grandson. Richard sorted through the bounty with a mixture of amusement and irritation as he prepared for work. 3 days had passed since the incident with Karen Whitfield, and the neighborhood's collective guilt showed no signs of abating. Every time Richard stepped outside, to collect his mail, to take out the trash, to get into his car, a neighbor would materialize with a strained smile and another offering. He'd started donating the food to the hospital break room. His colleagues were thrilled, though they raised eyebrows when he explained the source. So let me get this straight. His fellow surgeon, Dr. Patel, had said yesterday while helping himself to a slice of apple pie, "Your neighbor called the cops on you for gardening while black, then found out you're the mayor's brother and now the whole neighborhood is drowning you in baked goods?" "That about sums it up," Richard had replied. Dr. Patel had shaken his head. "Man, you should milk this. Ask for something big. A swimming pool. A home theater system. College funds for your future kids." Richard had laughed, but the joke didn't quite land. There was something unsettling about the neighborhood's sudden shift from suspicion to sycophancy. Their apologies felt less about acknowledging wrongdoing and more about protecting themselves from potential consequences. As he knotted his tie and grabbed his travel mug, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from James. "How's Pinecrest Heights treating its newest celebrity?" Richard typed back, "Like I'm either going to sue them or give them a tax break. Not sure which they fear more." James's reply came quickly. "Both, probably. Still coming to dinner Friday?" "Wouldn't miss it," Richard responded, then slipped the phone into his pocket and headed out the door. He'd timed his departure perfectly, early enough that most neighbors would still be getting ready for work, too busy to intercept him with another peace offering. But as he locked his front door, he spotted Karen Whitfield retrieving her newspaper from her driveway across the street. Their eyes met briefly before Karen quickly looked away, hurrying back toward her house as if Richard might chase her down. He sighed and continued to his car. This awkward dance couldn't go on forever. They were neighbors. Eventually, they'd have to find a way to coexist. The hospital provided a welcome distraction from neighborhood politics. Richard threw himself into his work, performing 2 scheduled surgeries and consulting on 3 more cases. It was nearly 8 in the evening when he finally headed home, exhausted but satisfied with the day's outcomes. As he turned onto his street, Richard noticed an unusual number of cars parked along the curb. Light spilled from the windows of the community center at the end of the block, and he could see silhouettes moving inside. The neighborhood association meeting, he remembered. Thomas Wilson had invited him on Sunday, but Richard had deliberately scheduled himself for a late surgery to avoid attending. He parked in his driveway and was about to head inside when his phone rang. It was James. "Hey," Richard answered, juggling his keys and briefcase. "Just got home. Long day." "Good timing," James replied. "I'm 5 minutes from your place." "Need to talk to you about something." Richard frowned. "Everything okay?" Fine. Just wanted to run something by you. See you in a few." True to his word, James pulled up 5 minutes later. He was still in his mayoral attire, suit tie, flag pin on his lapel, which meant he'd come straight from official business. "Don't tell me," Richard said as James climbed the porch steps. "The city council has voted to declare my front yard a historical landmark after Sunday's dramatic standoff." James chuckled. "Not quite. But there have been developments inside." Richard poured them both a glass of water while James loosened his tie and settled onto the couch, which was now joined by a coffee table and 2 armchairs as Richard's unpacking progressed. "So," Richard prompted, "what developments?" James leaned forward. "The video went viral." Richard stared at him. "What video?" "Of Sunday's confrontation. One of your neighbors posted it online. It's got over 200,000 views already." Richard sat down heavily. "You said you'd make sure that didn't happen." "I tried," James said, looking genuinely apologetic. "But once these things get out, the good news is you come across really well. Dignified, calm in the face of clear prejudice. And Karen?" James winced. "Not so well. There's already a hashtag, or gardening while black. And another one, Karen vs. Richard." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Great. Just what I wanted when I moved back home. Internet infamy. It's not all bad," James insisted. "The story's starting to get picked up by local news. I've been getting calls all day from reporters wanting statements. Please tell me you didn't give any." "Of course not. Not without talking to you first." James hesitated. but I think we should consider it. This could be an opportunity, Rich. Richard raised an eyebrow. An opportunity for what exactly? To address something that happens every day in this city. To use our positions to spark a real conversation about racial profiling. About who belongs where, about... Our positions? Richard interrupted. You mean your position as mayor and my position as the guy who got harassed for watering his plants? James frowned. That's not fair. You know what I mean? I do know, Richard said, his voice tight. And I'm not interested in becoming the poster child for neighborly racism. I moved here to work and live in peace, not to launch a social justice campaign. Sometimes these things choose us, Rich. We don't choose them. Richard shook his head. Not this time. I'm a surgeon, not an activist. I save lives in the operating room, not by giving sound bites to the evening news. A knock at the door interrupted their brewing argument. Richard opened it to find Thomas Wilson standing on his porch, looking slightly out of breath. Dr. Matthews, he said. I hope I'm not intruding. We noticed you weren't at the association meeting and, well, there's something we'd like to discuss with you. Richard glanced back at James, who shrugged. Come in, Mr. Wilson, Richard said, stepping aside. Thomas entered, then stopped short when he saw James. Mayor Matthews, I didn't realize you were here. This actually makes things easier. What can we do for you, Thomas? James asked, slipping smoothly into his political persona. Thomas cleared his throat. We've been discussing the unfortunate events of Sunday morning at our meeting. The entire neighborhood is deeply embarrassed by what happened. So I gathered from the steady stream of casseroles, Richard said dryly. Thomas had the grace to look sheepish. Yes, well, we want to do more than just say sorry with food. We want to take concrete action. Richard exchanged a glance with James. What kind of action? The association has unanimously voted to implement a new anti-bias training program for all neighborhood watch volunteers, Thomas explained. And we'd like to organize a community forum on racial profiling and its impact. That's actually a good idea, James said, sounding genuinely impressed. There's more, Thomas continued. We'd like to invite Dr. Matthews to lead the discussion, to share his perspective and help us understand how we can do better. Richard stared at him. You want me to stand up in front of the people who watched me get questioned by police for gardening in my own yard and explain to them why that was wrong? Thomas flushed. When you put it that way, it does sound rather insensitive. But we thought, given your position at the hospital and your connection to the mayor's office, you might be willing to help guide us. My connection to the mayor's office? Richard repeated flatly. James stepped in smoothly. It's an interesting proposal, Thomas. My brother will need some time to consider it. When is this forum planned for? 2 weeks from now. Saturday afternoon at the community center. Richard wanted to refuse outright, but something stopped him. He thought of his parents, his father, who had marched for civil rights in the 60s, his mother, who had integrated the local teachers' college. What would they have done in his position? I'll think about it, he said finally. Thomas beamed. Wonderful. That's all we ask. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Karen Whitfield has stepped down as head of the neighborhood watch. The association felt it was appropriate. Given the circumstances after Thomas left, the brothers sat in silence for a moment. Well, James said eventually, it seems your neighbors are taking this seriously. Or they're in damage control mode because the video went viral, Richard countered. Does it matter? If the end result is positive change, Richard didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. Across the way, Karen's house was dark. He wondered if she was hiding inside, avoiding the neighbors who had so quickly turned against her, or if she was at the meeting, facing their judgment. You know what bothers me most? He said finally. None of those people stood up for me on Sunday. They all just watched. And now they want me to educate them. James joined him at the window. So educate them. Make them uncomfortable. Make them understand. You've always been better with words than I have, even if I'm the one who went into politics. Richard smiled slightly. Mom used to say you had the charm and I had the substance. She wasn't wrong. Richard thought about the forum, about standing in front of his neighbors and speaking his truth. It wouldn't be easy. But maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. I'll do it, he decided. But on my terms. Not as the mayor's brother. Not as the victim in a viral video. But as Dr. Richard Matthews, new homeowner in Pinecrest Heights who expects better from his community. James squeezed his shoulder. That's my little brother, always finding the high road, even when others take the low one. Outside, the meeting at the community center was breaking up, neighbors spilling onto the sidewalk in small groups, talking animatedly. Richard watched them, these strangers who were now his community, for better or worse. Sunday's confrontation had been a terrible welcome, but perhaps it could lead to something meaningful after all. 3 months had passed since that fateful Sunday morning. The summer heat had given way to the first crisp days of autumn, and Richard's garden had flourished under his careful attention. The roses that had been the catalyst for so much drama now bloomed in vibrant reds and pinks, drawing compliments from passers-by. Richard stood on his back deck, checking the temperature of his new grill. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his yard, where tables and chairs had been arranged for the neighborhood barbecue he was hosting. It hadn't been his idea. The community forum 2 months ago had ended with Thomas Wilson suggesting a social gathering, and somehow Richard had volunteered his newly landscaped backyard as the venue. Need any help? James asked, emerging from the house with a tray of raw burger patties. I think I've got it under control, Richard replied, adjusting the heat. How's it looking inside? Patricia Wilson has taken over your kitchen. I think she's rearranged all your spices. Richard laughed. As long as she leaves them in better order than she found them. Inside, the house had been transformed. No more moving boxes, no half-assembled furniture. Richard had settled in properly, hanging artwork, arranging books, making the space truly his. And now, for the first time, he was opening his home to the neighbors who had given him such a memorable welcome. The doorbell rang, signaling the first guests had arrived. Richard wiped his hands on a towel and headed inside, where James was already greeting Thomas and Patricia Wilson at the door. Dr. Matthews, Thomas said warmly, your home looks wonderful. You've done amazing things with the place. Please call me Richard, he reminded them, accepting a dish from Patricia. What's this? My famous potato salad, she said proudly. Family recipe. More neighbors arrived in quick succession. The Parker family from down the street brought their teenage children, who immediately asked if they could connect to Richard's Wi-Fi. The Chens from next door arrived with homemade spring rolls. Dr. Patel and his wife came bearing a bottle of expensive whiskey. For after everyone leaves, he whispered to Richard with a wink. There was an ease to these interactions that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. The community forum had been a turning point. Richard had spoken honestly about his experience that Sunday morning, and the countless similar experiences throughout his life. He hadn't held back, hadn't softened his words to make his audience more comfortable, and to his surprise, they had listened. Really listened. The forum had extended well beyond its scheduled 2 hours, with neighbors asking questions, sharing their own stories, and, most importantly, committing to do better. The anti-bias training for Neighborhood Watch volunteers had expanded into a community-wide initiative. A new family, a young interracial couple with twin toddlers, had moved onto the block last month and been welcomed with genuine warmth. As Richard watched his backyard fill with neighbors, he felt a cautious sense of pride. Not everything had been fixed. Real change took more than a few months. But it was a start. One person was noticeably absent from the gathering. Despite Richard's explicit invitation, Karen Whitfield had declined to attend. Her husband Greg had called that morning to apologize, explaining that Karen wasn't feeling well. Richard suspected it was more complicated than that. He hadn't spoken directly to Karen since that Sunday. He'd seen her, of course. It was impossible to avoid neighbors entirely. But their interactions had been limited to distant nods when their paths crossed. Karen had become something of a pariah in the neighborhood, the unwitting villain in a story that had resonated far beyond Pinecrest Heights. The video had eventually faded from the news cycle, but its impact lingered. Karen had stepped down not just from the Neighborhood Watch but from all her community roles. Greg still attended association meetings, sitting quietly in the back, but Karen had withdrawn completely from neighborhood life. Richard was turning burgers on the grill when James appeared at his side. "Someone's at the front door for you," he said quietly. "Karen Whitfield." Richard's eyebrows shot up. "Really? Want me to tell her you're busy?" Richard handed the spatula to his brother. "No, I'll talk to her. Watch these for me." Karen was standing stiffly on his front porch, clutching a ceramic dish. She'd lost weight since he'd last seen her up close, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Dr. Matthews," she said formally. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Richard," he corrected gently. "And no, you're not interrupting. I'm glad you decided to come." Karen looked past him toward the sounds of laughter coming from the backyard. "I'm not staying. I wanted to bring this." She held out the dish. "It's a peach cobbler, my grandmother's recipe." Richard accepted it. "Thank you. It looks delicious." An awkward silence fell between them. Karen seemed to be gathering her courage for something. Finally, she spoke. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "A real one, not the performance I gave that Sunday." Richard leaned against the doorframe, studying her face. "I'm listening. What I did was wrong. Not just impolite or misguided, wrong." Karen met his eyes directly for the first time. "I've spent these past months telling myself it was a misunderstanding, that I was just being cautious, that anyone would have done the same. But that's not true." She took a deep breath. "The truth is, I saw you, a black man, in our neighborhood, and I immediately assumed you didn't belong. I didn't consider any other possibility, and then I called the police, putting you in potential danger, without a second thought." Richard nodded slowly, appreciating her honesty. "I've been doing a lot of reading," Karen continued. "A lot of thinking. About implicit bias, about privilege, about the assumptions I make without even realizing it." She glanced down. "I should have been at the community forum. I was too ashamed." "It's never too late to join the conversation," Richard said. Karen shook her head. "The neighborhood has moved on without me, and rightly so. I became the cautionary tale, the example of what not to do." Her smile was sad. "My own children won't bring their kids to visit anymore. My daughter says she doesn't want them around my toxic attitudes." Richard hadn't expected to feel sympathy for Karen, but he did. "People can change," he said. "I've seen it. Can they?" Karen asked. "Really change, I mean. Not just modify their behavior because they're afraid of being caught on video, but actually change how they think?" It was a good question. Richard had asked himself the same thing many times over the past months, watching his neighbors transform from suspicious strangers to friendly acquaintances. Was it genuine growth or just self-preservation? "I believe they can," he said finally. "But it takes work. Constant, deliberate work," Karen nodded. "That's what I'm trying to do." "The work?" She gestured vaguely. "I should let you get back to your guests. You could join us," Richard offered. "There's plenty of food." For a moment, Karen looked tempted. Then she shook her head. "Not today, but maybe sometime." As she turned to leave, Richard called after her. "Karen." She paused, looking back. "I'm hosting a book club next month. We're reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. You'd be welcome to join." Karen's expression softened. "I'd like that." "Thank you." Richard watched her walk back across the street, her posture a little straighter than when she'd arrived. Then he carried the peach cobbler to the kitchen and rejoined his guests in the backyard. James intercepted him by the grill. "How'd it go?" "Better than expected," Richard admitted. "I think she's genuinely trying." "People can surprise you," James said, handing back the spatula. "Sometimes even in good ways." The afternoon stretched into evening. Lights came on in the backyard as the sun set, and someone started playing music. Children chased each other across the lawn, while adults gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. Dr. Patel cornered Richard by the dessert table. "So," he said, gesturing around at the gathering, "not exactly what you expected when you moved in, huh?" Richard smiled. "Not even close. Regrets?" Richard considered the question. He thought about that Sunday morning, about the police in his front yard, about the humiliation and anger he'd felt. He thought about the viral video, the community forum,